Sup guys, this is Nick aka Stewie Stag coming at you for PokerVip.com, and today we're going to look at some of the HUD stats. I'm going to give you kind of a basic beginner's guide to what sort of stats we want on there to start off with, what the stats stand for, what they mean, why we have them, how we can use it, and what we're looking for in our own game to make sure that we are playing to the best of our ability and kind of aren't being exploitable. If we look at some pre-flop stats, we're going to start off with VPIP, which stands for voluntary put-in pot. It pretty much means when a player puts in money when they don't have to. So they decide to limp from a position that isn't the big blind, or they limp from the small blind because they're still putting in another half big blind. Whether they call a raise that has already happened, or if they raise themselves, pretty much every time they do that, it's going to add to this stat, which is expressed as a percent. So if somebody has a VPIP of 30, it means that they've played 30% of the hands that have been dealt to them, either by limping in, calling a raise, raising themselves. We have it to kind of straight away work out what type of player we're up against. If they're playing a very wide range of hands, 70, 80, 90%, even 100%, we're straight away going to realize that they have a very wide range, and on top of that, they're going to be probably not the best player. They're going to be more of a Gamby player because they're playing hands like 7-3 off, 8-5 off, just because they've been given the hand and they want to play it. So we can straight away not only deduce how wide someone plays, but also whether they're a good player or not. And often, unless they're doing some type of challenge themselves, if they've got a very high VPIP, they're not going to be that good. We can also tell if someone is very tight. For example, if they have a VPIP of only about 15, maybe 20, it means that they are only playing a small percentage of the hands which are dealt to them, which would, I would say 99.9% of the time, mean they're playing the best hands that are dealt to them, and therefore we can begin to adjust correctly against that. We ourselves want to have a VPIP of probably in the low 20s. If you're just starting out, that's the kind of range that is acceptable, or is seen to be profitable. And we're going to talk a lot more about this when we look at the next stat to see how they combine. And the next stat is PFR, which stands for pre-flop raise. This pretty much means every time we raise pre-flop, whether it be from early position, mid position, small blind, raising the big blind, this all goes into here. And again, we can begin to see straight away how many hands people play. If they've got a high PFR, then they are playing a lot of hands and they're raising a lot of hands, so we begin to see how aggressive they are. If their PFR is fairly low, we can tell that they're again only raising the best of their hands. And when we begin to look at it combined with VPIP, we begin to form more of an idea of over the player. If they've got a high VPIP and a low PFR, we can say, okay, well, they're raising their very strong hands and all the other hands they're just calling with. If they've got a high VPIP and high PFR, they're playing a lot of hands very aggressively. So they could be just a maniac guy who's just blast, blast, blast. And if they've got a medium VPIP and medium PFR, again, in general, this would mean that they're a decent player. They kind of know what they're doing. They know that raising is better than calling in most spots, and are clued up a bit more about the game. It's important to realize that the PFR can obviously never be higher than the VPIP, as you can't raise more than you play hands, if you like. We want our PFR to be slightly smaller. Obviously, it's going to be smaller than our VPIP. We don't want it too much smaller, a few percent. So if we've got a VPIP of 22, we want our PFR to be 18, 19, 20, in that kind of region. Anything lower than that, and you begin being a bit too passive. And yeah, we want to keep it to 3 or 4 points between them, just so that we don't become, like I said, too passive. 3B, which stands for free bet. This is pretty much when a player, say, in mid position raises and the button re-raises them. This is a free bet. We have it to see how likely someone is to free bet our raise. If someone's not free betting at all, we can then be like, we realize that we can raise knowing that it's unlikely that we're going to have to put any more money in pre-flop unless they've got a very strong hand. Whereas if they've got a very big free bet, we know that it's a lot more likely that they're going to raise us, and therefore we are going to have to put in more money, or face another decision. And again, linking into the VPIP and PFR, the higher it is, it's sort of the wider range they can have. If they've got a free bet of only 2 or 3, for example, that means that only say 2% of the time when someone raises, they're re-raising, which suggests that they have a very nutted range of aces and kings, maybe queens, maybe an ace king, but no other hand really get in there. Whereas if they've got a free bet of around 10, they're going to have they're still going to have those hands, but they're going to have some more semi bluffs, some more pure bluffs, and they're going to be slightly harder to read. Given all of that, we kind of want to have a free bet of around 8% overall. It changes from position to position. Our free bet in the button and blinds is going to be a lot higher than mid position, for example. But overall, you want to kind of keep it around 8 because that keeps us balanced with value hands, semi bluffs, and pure bluffs playing against the right types of players. ST stands for steal, and this is when a player raises in late position with the intention to steal the blind. So they might raise from the button, big blind and small blind, then fold, and they take down the blinds in the end of the hand. We use it to see how likely someone is stealing against us. If we're in the small blind and the button opens and they are opening 70% of the time, then it makes it a much more profitable spot to free bet or just to call, because their range is a lot wider rather than someone whose steal is say only 30%, who we want to be a little bit more cautious against because their range is just that bit tighter. We can also begin to deduce again how decent a player is. If their steal isn't much higher than their PFR, it would generally mean that they're playing the strength of their cards rather than their position, which is not really that advisable, and it would suggest that they aren't that much of a thinking player and someone who we can begin to target as being a fish. Ours, it kind of depends on your game, but you really want on the button it to be 50 and above. And in the cutoff 30 and above, and in the small blind you want to be raising most small blinds when folded to against the right types of players, of course. And finally, we're going to look at fold versus steal, which pretty much is how likely an opponent is to fold versus a late position open. If we have a hand on the button and we look over at the small and big blind stats and see they both have a high fold versus steal, it literally doesn't matter what hand we have because it's going to be profitable to raise it, as they're going to be folding a lot of the time. We ourselves don't want this to be too high, but if it's too low, we begin playing at too wide of a range, often out of position. So in general, you want this to be around 65, maybe 70, because that's kind of the point where players can't really exploit you from it. And any higher people can begin to exploit, and any lower people, well, it's just harder for you to play rather than harder for your opponents to play. The important thing to see here is how all of these kind of link together. If someone's got a high VPIP, low PFR and low free bet, low steal and low folder steal, it suggests that they're playing a lot of hands very passively. If they've got a high VPIP, high PFR, high free bet, high steal, low fold versus steal, they're going to be an aggressive type of player who's more likely to be betting rather than just calling. They're going to be a bit of a pain to play against. If they're all really high, then they're probably more of a maniac-y type of guy, but they're still a lot harder to play against someone who's just calling, being very passive. And if they've kind of got the sort of stats I've been talking about, so VPIP in the low 20s, PFR in the high teens, low 20s, free bet sort of around 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, steal in the upper 50s, 40s, and fold versus steal around 60, 65, 70, then you can begin to see that these are the better players. They're the types of players who we don't really want to be playing against because they're not that exploitable, and we'll be able to find leaks in our games because we can begin to assume they're a bit of a thinking player. Let's now have a look at some post-flop stats. Start off with the C bet, which stands for continuation bet, and this is when the original raise of post flop leads the flop. So in really basic terms, we'll give you an example. For example, if we give you an example, the button raises, the small blind calls, flop comes out, small blind checks, and the button bets. This is called a continuation bet because they're continuing their aggression from the pre-flop. We use this to kind of determine, again, how aggressive someone is. If they've got high C bet, it suggests that they're going to be betting a lot of the time post-flop. If they have a high c-bet, we can also determine, we can also come to the conclusion that he's not going to be doing this with all of his value hands, so we can begin to play back at that. Whereas if he's got a very low c-bet, then you can begin to assume that when he bets post-flop, he generally has it, and you can begin to consider folding as opposed to raising more often. And again, you can see if someone's playing their cards or playing their spot. In general, we with the stats we've discussed pre-flop, we kind of want this to be in the 70s. Anything between 65 and 80 really would be acceptable. The general rule that I go by, and I think is the best rule, is that the higher VPIP and PFR you have, the lower your continuation bet should be, just because your range is that much wider. You only want to be continuing when you have equity, as otherwise you're gonna find yourself in a lot of very awkward spots, and people are still not going to give you as much respect for a c-bet when you're opening so wide. So you want to kind of reduce that a little bit. And if you're a tighter player, if you're playing like a 19-16 sort of style, or even tighter than that, 19-16, 19 being VPIP, 16 being PFR, of course, then your continuation bet can be higher, because we in general have better cards and a better range than our opponents. FVC bet, which means fold versus continuation bet. And this kind of means that if we use the example we did before, where the button raises pre-flop, the small blind calls, the flop comes, the small blind checks, the button c-bets, and then the small blind folds is when they fold to a continuation bet. We have the stat purely to see how likely someone is to fold against us. If they're folding all the time, we're gonna c-bet pretty much every flop, because we know that they're gonna fold unless they have a very strong piece of it. Whereas if they're folding rarely to continuation bets, we're going to begin betting when we have a lot of equity ourselves, and not bothering when we're making a pure bluff, purely because they're not going to fold enough to make that bluff profitable. Our fold versus c-bet generally doesn't want to be too high, because otherwise players will just c-bet against us. To make it difficult for them, I kind of look around the 50 kind of area. 50, maybe 40 percent. Again, both of these are expressed as a percentage. In fact, most of these stats are as a percentage. But yeah, if we kind of aim for the 40-50% kind of mark, it makes it difficult for our opponents to begin c-betting into us. It balances our range between hands that when we've flopped a really strong piece, and when we've flopped some equity that we can achieve later on in the hand, I suppose, or realize later on in the hand is a better way. So ourselves, we don't want it to be too high. Again, if we have it too low though, people begin just bet, and because they know that we're calling down with anything. This kind of continues on into this WTSD, which stands for went to showdown. Pretty much this is when a player doesn't fold in the hand, and they show down their cards after the river's been dealt. We can, if this number is particularly high, we can begin to realize that players are calling us down a lot, so we can bet a lot more into them, knowing that they're more likely to call. Whereas if it's quite low, we realize that if they are getting to showdown, generally they're going to have a strong hand, so therefore we need a strong hand to begin betting into them, because we're not going to get calls from as many worse hands as we would against someone with a high went to showdown. Ours really depends on the players we're playing against, our aggression factor, all of those kind of things, so it's not quite as obvious what kind of number you want. I'm not even going to really throw a number out there, just because it's based on our play, based on the players you play against, based on the site you play on, so there's a lot of variables that can change this, but we can certainly deduce a lot from other players. If they have a particularly high number, we can deduce things. If they have a particularly low number, we can deduce things. We can also combine this with one at showdown. This is pretty much they go to the river, they show down their cards, and if they won, then this goes in here. If they win, 8 out of 10, they're going to have a one at showdown of 80%. If they won 4 out of 10, they're going to have a one at showdown of 40%. This combined with went to showdown is really important. If someone's going to showdown a lot and winning at showdown quite a lot, you kind of want to begin realizing that they're probably a tighter player from the start. If they go and showdown a lot and winning at showdown not that much, you can again begin to, like we said before, we can begin to bet into them more, knowing that they're going to call us down with worse. And if their went to showdown is low and their won at showdown is very high, then generally they're going to showdown with their better hands, and those better hands are obviously winning more. So you can begin to make a plan for the hand based on these, which is really important in No Limit Hold'em. The final stat is a results-based stat, which is BB per 100, which stands for big blinds won per 100 hands. Pretty much this kind of just sums up how much money we're winning. If over 20,000 hands, we win 10 buy-ins. That can also be expressed as 1 buy-in per 2,000 hands, 500 or half a buy-in per 1,000 hands, or 5 big blinds per 100 hands. Half a buy-in per 1,000 hands, I think I said that. And yeah, so if you have that win rate, that's really good. That's kind of where you want to aim for. But anything really between 2 and 7 is acceptable, or it is seen as is good. If you're at the lower end of that, then I would not advise you to move up stakes. You still got a lot to learn. You can still pick up. You can find some leaks. And if you're at the top end of that, you can begin to look at moving up stakes, because the players you're playing against, you're obviously crushing, and you can look to move up because you can win at a higher level, gain more experience, and probably win more money. Anything higher than 7, I would begin to say you need a bigger sample. And if you've already got a massive sample, then you want to see how hot you're running. If you're running miles above EV, or you are just literally crushing those games and you really need to move up really quickly. If it's lower than 2, you can definitely find some leaks. You can definitely find some big ways to improve your game. But anywhere in sort of like 2, 3, 4, 5 is anything in there is I would take that any day. So that's kind of where we want to be aiming for. We can't really use this on our opponents purely because we don't have a big enough hand sample to base it on. If you've only got 1,000 hands on them, which is still a decent sample in terms of HUD stats, especially if you're a 6-max player in the micro stakes where you don't have that many. You don't have that bigger field. You have such a bigger field that you aren't playing the same people over and over again. If you have 1,000 hands on someone, that's such a small sample in terms of how much they've won that we can't really take much from it. But saying that, if they have the sort of stats we've been mentioning, so VPIP and PFR in the low 20s, the correct sort of ranges for C betting, fold versus C betting, all those kind of numbers that we've discussed. But if they have those numbers in that ballpark and their big blind per 100 is 4 or 5 in there, you can begin to assume that they are a winning player. Whereas if they've got stats that are incorrect or not necessarily incorrect but way out there that we've kind of highlighted as being poor stats, and their big blind per 100 is losing, you can safely assume they're a losing player. But it's not all that useful to look at, because over a 800 hand, 900 hand sample, they can have got aces in against kings 4 times and won. So we can't base too many assumptions on that. So yeah, that kind of comes to the end of the beginner's guide to HUD stats. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a lot from it, and you can go out there and start crushing.